Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of setting up a basic platformer in Unity that works with a keyboard as well as a gamepad. If you missed part 1, you're going to want to check that out. I'll leave a card right here. Now let's get right into it. So next, let's get the jump up and working. We'll do the code first and then we'll animate it. And we want this jump to be variable height, meaning the longer you hold down the jump button, the higher you will jump up to a certain distance. So we'll add this code into the player script as well. So let's add 2 variables. We're going to keep them private, so we'll serialize the fields so that we can actually see them in the inspector. Private float jump force. We'll default that to 5. And private float jump time. Let's default that to 0.5. We'll play with those values a little later. And to keep this a little more organized in the inspector, let's add a header attribute. This one will be movement. We'll put jump above these 2. Turn check above right leg and left leg. So now you can see if you go back into the inspector and you go down here, it just adds some headers, which just makes it a little cleaner and separates things out. So we're going to need a couple more variables. We're going to create a private bool called isJumping, a private bool called isFalling, and a private float called jumpTimeCounter. So in our update function, which runs every frame, let's add a function called jump, which we will now need to create. So this is already starting to look a little bit messy. So before we create that, let's add hashtag region movement functions. And after move, hashtag end region. And then we'll do a region for turn checks, which goes all the way down here. We'll end that region. And that will allow you to minimize all of those functions together so that we can keep our code nice and clean. You can see if you highlight over top of it, it shows you which functions are included. So next, let's create our jump function. So even though jumps are actually one of the more basic things that you can add into a platformer, they're a little more complicated to code, but we'll try and keep this as simple as possible. So we actually need to know 3 things in regards to our input in the jump function. We need to know when we first press down the jump button, when we are holding the jump button, and when we release the jump button. So let's set that up. So if user input.instance.controls, and I forgot to actually set that up in our controls. So let's comment that out and come back to it. So back in our controls input actions over here, we're going to create a new action map called jumping. Let's rename this to jump. We'll change action type to pass through and control type button should be fine. So click on the plus and let's add a binding. The first one will be the space bar on our keyboard, which will go in our keyboard control scheme, and we'll add our south button into the gamepad control scheme and save your asset. Let's go back into our script and uncomment that. Now user input.instance.controls.jumping.jump.was pressed this frame. And that's actually a function, so we need to open and close brackets. So that handles when it was pushed down for the first time. Now we want to know when it's being held down. So if user input.instance.controls.jumping.jump.is pressed. And finally, if user input.instance.controls.jumping.jump.was released this frame. So if we just pushed down the jump button, then isJumping is going to be equal to true. And if it was just released, then isJumping is going to be equal to false. Now let's actually manipulate the velocity of the rigid body to get our player actually jumping. We're going to pass in the current velocity on the X so that we can continue to move left and right even when we're in the air. And we'll add in our jump force for the Y. Now, we said this was going to be a variable jump, meaning the longer you hold the button, the more height you're going to get on your jump. So let's copy and paste this into this function here. It's going to tell us that isJumping is assigned, but it's not actually being used. We'll fix that in a minute. So when we're testing this out, you can see if you press down the spacebar, he gets a little hop, and if you hold down the spacebar, he gets a nice jump. We'll get that looking a little smoother and more responsive in a second, but there are a few problems we need to take care of. This is a really floaty jump, so let's fix that first. I'm actually going to change the gravity scale to 7. We haven't done anything with jump time yet, but let's do a jump force of about 12. That's feeling a little better now. Now, there are a few problems here. You can just keep jumping infinitely. You can also just hold the spacebar down forever and the character will just keep on going. So let's fix that first. What we want to do is actually use this jump time as the maximum time we are allowed to hold down the jump button before he starts falling again. So this is going to act as our maximum, and this is going to act as the actual counter. So when we first push down the jump button, we're going to make the jump time counter equal to our jump time. Essentially meaning every time we press down the jump button, we're going to reset our counter. Now we'll handle the actual timer in the isPressed if statement here. So if we are holding down the jump button, and if the jump time counter is greater than 0, and we are jumping, and is jumping is equal to true, then we'll actually allow the velocity to be manipulated. And now we need to actually decrease this counter while we're holding down the jump button. So jump time counter minus equals time.delta time. So time.delta time represents the amount of time since the last frame rendered, and this runs every single frame. So this is how we make the counter match the frame rate exactly. So if we still have some time left and we're jumping, then we'll actually apply the jump force. Otherwise, is jumping is going to be equal to false. So now that should have fixed our problem where we could just hold down the jump button infinitely. Now you'll see it caps out right up there. That's actually a bit high. I'm going to change this to 0.35. All right, that's looking a little bit better. We can get this nice little hop, or we can get a nice long one. Now we need to fix the problem where we can actually jump in the air itself, which means we need to be able to detect when the player is on the ground. So let's do that now. So before we do that, we actually need to grab a reference to our collider that is attached to the player. We'll just grab a generic collider 2D, call it call, and grab a reference to that in our start function. So I don't want to just create a simple isGrounded method and just throw it in the update function, because we don't need to check for that every single frame. So first, down here, let's create a new region. Call it ground check. We'll end the region. And we'll create a private, and instead of void, let's create a private bool function called isGrounded. And now there are a few ways that you can do this, but we're going to do this with a raycast. So we need to create a variable of type raycast hit 2D. We'll call that ground hit. And so now that is going to be equal to physics2d.boxCast. So this acts the exact same as a raycast, which is an invisible line that would be shot towards the floor, and it would detect when it actually hit a collider, except this is going to create a box around the player's feet instead. So we just grabbed a reference to the collider, so we're going to say call.bounds.center for the origin. Next, we need this size. Collider.bounds.size. It's asking for the angle. We're just going to throw in a 0. And the direction, we want it to go down. So we're going to say vector2.down. Now it's asking for a distance. I would actually like to declare something up here. Let's create a new header called ground check. We're going to create a private float called extra height. This does not need to be very big. We can default it to 0.25. And while we're up here, we're also going to need a layer mask. Private layer mask, what is ground? So back down in our function, our distance is going to be our extra height. And now we can optionally add a layer mask, and we will add in what is ground. Again, raycasts and boxcasts, they are looking for colliders in the scene, but you can add a layer mask to ignore certain physics layers. So we only want the box down by the player's feet to be detecting what is ground and nothing else. So because this is a type bool, we have to give this a return type. So we will say if groundHit.collider does not equal null, meaning it found a collider, it found something, then we will return true, else return false. Now, before we go any further, we just created a serialized layer mask. Let's go ahead and fill that in the inspector. So down here, what is ground? We will have to create a new layer. So go up here, click layer, and click add layer. Let's call it ground. And now we can add ground to what is ground. And before we forget, let's go to the floor object over here, change the physics layer from default to ground. So now what we can do is up here, when we are checking if we pushed down the jump button, we can say if the jump button was pushed and is grounded. Let's test that. You can spam the jump button as much as you want, but he's only going to jump once he is touching the floor. Now, the only thing that I don't like about raycasts is that they're invisible. So what I'm actually going to do is create a new region called debug functions. And feel free to pause and copy and paste this code if you would like to use it. We need to actually call this somewhere, so we will put that at the bottom of the jump function. Now, if we do that, if we hit play and you select the gizmos box up here so you can actually see the gizmos, let's actually enable our background again. I forgot to do that earlier. And now you can see the actual BoxCast, and you can see that it turns red when we're not touching the ground and it turns green when we are touching the ground. So again, if you want that function, that is right here. Moving on. Now I would like to get this jump animated. So let's go ahead and set up the animations first, and then we'll handle the code side of things. There are multiple ways that you can handle this. We are actually going to set up 3 different animations, none of which are going to loop. So click on your player, go over here to the animation window and click create new clip. Let's call one takeoff. This is literally just going to be 1 frame. So let's add the scale in the transform of the character's body. Get rid of those end frames at the 1 second mark. Hit record, and I'm actually just going to do 0.8 on the X and 1.2 on the Y. We're just going to stretch the crap out of him. And you can see his feet are going through the floor. That is because I changed the scale of player instead of body by accident. There we go, that's better. So that's the takeoff pose. Now let's create the actual jump animation. This is actually going to be a 3-second long animation, but it's not going to be any more difficult than the other ones. So click on player and click record, making sure that the jump is enabled. We're going to start with the legs spread wide apart. Again, if you want to disable the background, make sure you unselect the record button, disable that. So at the 3-second mark, or 180 frames, we're actually just going to make the legs split apart even a little bit more. So they'll just keep on getting wider and wider as he's jumping longer and longer. We're also going to go back to frame 1 and lean his body backwards just a little bit. And let's keep it leaning back more and more. So we'll create an end keyframe where it's leaned back even more. So you can see it starts to go like this. Let's also make the scythe rotate. So at the 180 frame mark, rotate it backwards just slightly. The body actually rotates so much that we need to reposition the legs just a little bit to make them follow at the 3-second mark. Now this is a really slow animation, which looks nice if your character is falling for a really long time, but it would be nice to get something happening near the beginning of the animation, which looks a little bit faster to make it feel more responsive. So at frame 5, let's actually rotate his head down. And at the 180 frame mark, you can just rotate it down even a little bit more. So now let's see how that looks. Great. And we're going to create one new animation called land. So in land at frame 3 with the record button selected, let's add the body scale in the transform. And we'll say 1.25 on the X and 0.75 on the Y. Squash him right down. And just to make sure the feet and the body are connected, let's move the body down just slightly. And at frame 5, let's change the scale on the X to 0.9 and on Y to 1.1. You're going to get this nice squash down when he lands, and then this little pop up, and then he'll go back to normal afterwards. Make sure you delete any keyframes that are at the 1 second mark. They always seem to default there. And before we go any further, I said that these land, takeoff, and jump are not going to be looping. So let's go into the animation, click jump, and uncheck loop time. Same with land. And same with takeoff. Okay, so now that we have set up those animations, let's set up our animator controller. You can see all the new animations have already been added in there. So we want to be able to get to the jump from any state. So we are going to drag this any state block over here, grab these and take them over here. It's going to go takeoff, jump, and land. So let's set up a transition from any state to takeoff, from takeoff to jump, from jump to land, and from land back to idle. So how is this going to work? Well, first we're going to need to set up two triggers. One is going to be jump and the other is going to be land. So to initialize the takeoff, we are going to set the condition. Whatever you move over here to the top is what's going to be selected first over here. So we're going to click plus and that'll default to jump. So to go from any state to takeoff, jump is our condition. Next, to go from takeoff to jump, we actually want has exit time checked. There's no condition. It's just going, this is going to play and then it's going to move on to the next one. To go from jump to land, we are actually going to, let's drag that up. Condition is going to be land. And to go from land back to idle, it is again going to be has exit time with no other condition. So we will set these triggers with code, but first there's a few other things I would like to change. So going from any state to takeoff, let's make sure that we don't have a transition duration. We want that to snap. From takeoff to jump, we're going to change exit time and transition duration to 0.075. And you can play with those and see what feels right to you once it's working. From jump to land, make sure that has exit time is unchecked and change this to 0.05. And from land back to idle, let's change exit time and duration to 0.085. Now let's figure out when to trigger these. So in order to trigger all of these properly, we're going to need when the player actually lands on the ground. And in order for that, we need to know when the player is falling. So remember, we set up this private bool. It's grayed out because it's still not being used. Let's fix that now. Now we're going to make one little change in here because we want to explicitly be able to control what happens when the timer reaches 0. So we're going to change this else to else if jump time counter is equal to 0, then his jumping is going to be false. Then we'll add one final else, his jumping is equal to false. Now the reason we added that is because we want to add is falling. We want that to be true as soon as the jump time counter equals 0, because as soon as it equals 0, we are no longer jumping up, we are starting to move down. And if neither of these conditions are true, we're not necessarily falling, but we're definitely not jumping. We also know that we are falling as soon as we release the jump button. So we created a land animation specifically, so we are going to need to check every frame if the character just landed. So let's add that in the jump function after this if statement down here. I'm going to say if we're not jumping, and we're going to need to create some sort of function for check for land. So we'll create that in just a second. So if we're no longer jumping and we have just landed, then we can actually go ahead and do it right now. anim.setTrigger land. And up here, when we first press the jump button and we are grounded, let's trigger the start of the jump. So let's create the check for land function now. Let's change the name of this region here from ground check to ground/landed check. And the way we're calling this, we're going to need to create another bool function. So let's create a private bool check for land. That'll take away the red squiggles up here. So how do we check to see if we land in a single frame? Well, we know it's going to be happening if we are falling. Now, if we are falling and if we are now grounded, then we know that the player has landed. And actually we can go ahead and change is falling equal to false right there, because you can see if you right click that and you go find all references, we actually haven't set it false once except for just now. So we need to set it false somewhere, so we will do it in the check for land function. And if they are falling and if they are now grounded, the player has landed, so we will return true since we called it check for land. If they are not grounded, then return false. And if they weren't falling in the first place, so else return false. Let's go ahead and test this. Great, that seems to be working. One thing you will notice though is if you spam the jump button a bunch of times, you'll see that the animation starts to get a little bit weird when you jump. So in order to fix that, we are actually going to create a coroutine, which is going to reset the trigger after one frame has ended. So we'll go up here and create a private coroutine. called reset trigger coroutine. So let's throw the coroutine right below the check for land function. So this is actually going to be a private enumerator called reset. And a coroutine works like a function, except you have to call them differently. And coroutines allow you to do things within a certain amount of time. So I could say do stuff and then yield return new wait for seconds. I could say wait for 5 seconds and then do something else. That's not what we're going to do here though. We want to wait just 1 frame. So yield return null is actually what we want. And then we're going to do anim.reset trigger land. So in order to call this coroutine, what we will do is we'll copy this variable we created up here, and down where we triggered the land animation, we will then reset trigger coroutine equals start coroutine reset, open bracket, close bracket, close bracket. And now if we test, you can see that no matter how much we spam, that doesn't seem to be happening anymore. But that's all I got for you guys today. I was thinking of setting up a wall jump for the next one. Let me know what you think, or if you have any ideas for other videos that I should do. Thanks, and see you in the next one.